The Boonta Eve Classic, a hot, dry arena filled with casual spectators and die-hard fans, roaring with the sound of cheering for their favorite racers as they hurtled toward victory or defeat. What's up, Star Wars fans? Jonesy here, and on today's episode of the Hyperspace Database, we're talking about every racer that participated in the Boonta Eve Classic pod race. There were 18 total racers in the Boonta Eve Classic race on Tatooine in The Phantom Menace. Today we are going to give you a brief bit of history on each racer and shine some light on their motivations for racing in this ultra-dangerous sport. Aldar Beedo was a male glimfid from the world Plu 2 and was an assassin and bounty hunter besides being a pod racer. He entered the Boonta Eve pod race at the request of fellow racer Wan Sandage to eliminate the Dug racer Sebulba and was paid to take him out and let Sandage win, though this did not end up happening, as Sandage didn't even finish and Anakin Skywalker won the race outright. Aldar eventually dropped the contract after Wan Sandage passed away, and ironically went to work for Sebulba as a bodyguard, where he found much success as the duo eliminated many racers in the pod racing circuit. Anakin Skywalker was a 9-year-old boy from the planet Tatooine, and was a slave to Watto the Toydarian. He raced in several pod races for Watto before the Boonta Eve race, but he never placed in any of them. In fact, he never even finished a race despite his skill in flying a pod racer. Sebulba was one of his biggest rivals, as the Dug was known to secretly cheat and disabled Anakin's pod on more than one occasion, causing it to crash and take the human boy out of the race. Anakin would eventually beat the Dug though, and leave Tatooine to become a Jedi Knight in the Jedi Order, though he did on one occasion race a pod racer again when he was a Jedi in training. Bumpy Roose was a dim-witted nucknog from the planet Sump, and preferred to smash into his opponents rather than outrace them. He once nearly lost a race to Anakin Skywalker, which made him a laughingstock among fellow racers, and he swore revenge on the young boy for this humiliation. He attempted to sabotage Anakin's pod at the Boonta Eve race, but being very dense, he didn't know which pod was Anakin's, so he accidentally sabotaged Ben Quadinaros' pod instead. In the race, instead of taking out Skywalker, he collided with fellow aggressive pod racer Dud Bolt, and the two racers took each other out, and they were carted off to recover in a Tatooine med center. Ben Quadinaros was a Toong from the Outer Rim planet Tund, and was known as somewhat of a coward, being intimidated by most social interactions of any kind. He had only raced on the safest courses in the galaxy before the Boonta Eve, and only entered the race because fellow racer Boles Roor had bet a ginormous sum of credits against Quadinaros even entering the race. Ben accepted the bet, rented a pod racer, and entered even though he was scared out of his mind. Although due to Roose's tampering with it before the race, the engines of the pod shot off in all different directions, and Ben was left in the cockpit on the track, bewildered and then terrified as the other racers zoomed by just overhead. Despite not even getting out of the gate, so to speak, he did enter the race, and collected the bet from Boles Roor, which he used to purchase his own pod and continue racing on the professional circuit. Boles Roor was a male Sneevil from the planet Sneeve, and was a professional glimmick genre singer, which was loud, frenetic music with thumping beats and sometimes inspirational lyrics. Boles was a professional in both arenas, as he won the Boonta Eve race twice in his career, and sung in the Kalarak Amphitheater on Coruscant. After one particularly boastful concert the night before the Boonta Eve race, he bet Ben Quadinaros that he wouldn't even enter the race, which to everyone's surprise, the young Toong accepted. Boles regretted making the foolhardy bet, but honored it even though Quadinaros didn't even make it off the starting block. Boles finished 6th in the race, but his placement was far overshadowed by his enormous debt to Quadinaros. After this point, he retired from full-time racing and concentrated on his music career, giving his pod to his chief mechanic Shrivel Braytrand, who fixed it up and flew it himself in many more pod races after that, though Boles did race in a few charity events to promote himself and his singing career from time to time. Clegg Holdfast was a male Nosorian pod racer from the planet New Plimto, and was the son of a fisherman and a candle maker, so he was kind of a joke to the other racers, though he proved himself to be a more than capable pilot. In truth, he was actually one of the top journalists for the Holo magazine Pod Racing Quarterly, and he raced to get the inside scoop on the other racers. Most people thought it was too dangerous for a journalist to race just to get inside information, but Clegg had a tough hide that allowed him to walk away from most crashes unscathed. Unfortunately, he went down in the second lap of the Boonta Eve Classic due to Sebulba's flamethrowers pushing him into a wall. But after Clegg got out of the hospital, he used his connections as a journalist to fudge the results of the race and put him finishing in 7th place, in order to preserve his reputation. Or just enough to continue writing for Pod Racing Quarterly, that is. Dud Bolt was a Volpterine male hitman and pod racer from the planet Volpter, and served as a bodyguard for Sebulba in pod races. While still a competent pilot, Dud Bolt preferred to earn a paycheck the easy way, and was content to be Sebulba's bodyguard, knocking out other racers, instead of winning himself. His job was to stay near the rear of the pack, see who was eyeing the lead, and then take them out. He did that job pretty well in the Boonta race, taking out fellow racer Roose, and Sebulba paid him a hefty bonus for this. Ironically, Dud Bolt would lose his job as Sebulba's bodyguard to Aldar Beedo, which enraged him, and that earned both Sebulba and Aldar Beedo a pretty high spot on Dud Bolt's hit list. Ebe E Endocott was a Triffian male pod racer from the planet Triffus. He used to be a delivery man before becoming a pod racer, performing unorthodox daredevil stunts in his swoop bike deliveries, which landed him in the hospital several times. After becoming a pod racer, he became famous for his wins on Malastare, which boosted his already inflated ego. He even bought a brand new Corellian freighter to haul his pod racer in. His ego got so big that he developed a great desire to defeat Sebulba the Dug in the Boonta race. Sadly, this did not work out so well though, as he finished 4th overall, but he took great comfort in the fact that Sebulba didn't even place, which he considered a huge win. Elan Mak was a Flugrian from the planet Plu 4, but Elan Mak was actually an alias. His real name was Cam Nail, who was the son of the crime boss Borzu Nail. Why was the son of a crime boss racing pods? That story leads us back to the hitman Aldar Beedo. Beedo was hired to eliminate Borzu Nail, and succeeded in murdering the Flugrian while getting away virtually undetected. Cam Nail then sought to avenge his father's death, so he cashed in his inheritance early and spent a ton of credits trying to track down his father's killer. After quite a long time of hunting, he finally was able to learn Beedo's name and track him down to Tatooine, and he sought to take him out in the Boonta Eve pod race, going under the name Elan Mak to avoid suspicion. While he failed to eliminate Aldar in the race, Elan Mak found that he rather enjoyed pod racing, as he managed to land a solid 5th place in the race. He would continue to try to eliminate Beedo on the racetrack, but eventually he overtook his father's criminal empire and sent numerous mercenaries to capture Aldar Beedo, which they eventually did and brought back to Nail to face judgment. Gasgano was a Zexto from the planet Troikan, and was among the most famous racers at the Boonta Eve Classic. He was a favorite among many pod racing bettors because of his racing skills, and many bet on him to overtake Sebulba for the win in the Boonta. Since he was a Zexto, he possessed 4 arms, which allowed him to make tons of small adjustments to his pod as he flew, and this gave him quite an edge when racing. While Gasgano ended up losing to Anakin Skywalker, he finished 2nd in the race, and rose to higher levels of popularity due to Sebulba's downfall, becoming a favorite on the pod racing prison moon Uvu 4. He was often considered an intellectual, except when he got drunk after a victory on the track, when he transformed into a fairly violent brawler. Mars Guo was a male Fui from the planet Fu, and often got into fights and brawls with the locals of Mos Espa due to his habits of heavy drinking and flirting with pretty women, despite him being rather small and fairly unattractive. This bad habit often got Mars into trouble, such as when he hit on one of Sebulba's personal masseuses, Angela. Unbeknownst to Guo, fellow racer Teemto Pagalies was infatuated with Angela, and reported this to Sebulba, who then sabotaged Guo's racer. This wasn't enough though, as Mars was able to keep his racer in the running, so Sebulba broke off a small bit of his pod and tossed it into Mars's racer engines, which caused the engines to explode and sent poor Mars flying away in his cockpit. While Mars Guo survived this awful crash, it pretty much ruined him, and it was a long time before he showed up in the pod racing circuit again. Mawhonic was a male Gran from the planet Hawk, and was an established pod racer on several worlds like Ando Prime, Malastare, and Ryloth. Interestingly, Mawhonic did not only race pods, he also operated as a merchant selling pod racer parts. He was a fairly skilled racer, and started in the front row during the Boonta Eve race, though this would prove to be his undoing, as Sebulba would not tolerate competition, and shoved Mawhonic into a wall, destroying his pod. Mawhonic would survive this wreck though and continued to race, though he lost again to Sebulba on more than one occasion. This drove the Gran into a rage, and he posted bounties on several of Sebulba's relatives, dead or alive, hoping to get revenge on the Dug indirectly. Neva Kee was a male Zamster pilot from the planet Zagobah, and raced the unusual Block 2 Special Pod Racer, which had its cockpit in the front rather than behind. Most other racers thought this was just crazy, as with a rear-mounted cockpit you at least had a small chance of surviving a crash, but with this model, whoever flew it had a death wish. It was often said that it looked more like a swoop bike than a pod racer, with its attached engines making it less of a pod and more like a bike. Kee was hailed as a revolutionary in pod racing by some, while others just thought he was insane, although he did have a cult following because of this unique style. Unfortunately, this popularity did not mean instant success for the Zamster, and although he was a skilled pilot, he fell to near last place in the Boonta Eve Classic, and on the end of the second lap, he flew off course near the Hutt Flats, and was never seen again. It is unknown if he perished in a crash or merely quit the race, but nonetheless, Neva Kee was not seen on the pod racing circuit after the Boonta Eve Classic. Ody Mandrell was a male Kit from Tatooine, and was one of the youngest pod racers in the sport before Anakin Skywalker. Ody was the quintessential daredevil, racing not for money or fame, but to experience the thrill of near-death racing. He was known for constantly flying at top speed, barely getting around corners without slowing down. Unfortunately, he rode his pod racer pretty hard, and this came back to bite him in the Boonta Eve race, as he had to take a pit stop in the second lap, which unfortunately ended up taking him out of the race completely as one of his dim-witted pit droids got sucked through one of his engines, disabling the pod and ruining the engine. This would not be the end of the Kit racer though, as Ody raced on several more planets in the following years. And when the Empire eventually outlawed pod racing, he ran a swoop bike racing garage on Tatooine with Teemto Pagalies, and after the Battle of Endor encountered Luke Skywalker, who was looking for information regarding the exploits of his father Anakin Skywalker. Tyerell was a male Elena pod racer from the planet Elan Mak, and was a nimble racer with incredible reflexes, though it would not be enough to save him in the tight confines of the Laguna Caves on Tatooine, where he perished in a fiery ball of racer wreckage, leaving behind a wife and 3 children, Julla, Deland, and Dobby. He was well liked by many of the other racers, and was an honest racer and gentleman on the track, though he, like many others, sought to eliminate Sebulba in the race, although he never got that far. Tyerell lost concentration on the second lap as Anakin Skywalker was steadily progressing up the ranks, and this split-second distraction, along with a sticky accelerator, caused the Elena to crash into a hanging stalactite, vaporizing him and his pod. His family was devastated by his death and fell on hard times, as Tyerell's own brother sold Ratz's daughter Julla to Sebulba as a slave, though Ratz's son Deland intended to enter the pod racing arena and free his sister from the Dug. This did not happen though, and instead, a teenage Anakin Skywalker came back and entered the race in his stead, and won Julla's freedom. Deland later went on to establish the Tyerell Foundation, which sought to end pod racing, to preserve the lives of its racers who had families who'd be left behind if they died while racing. Sebulba needs little introduction, but he was a male Dug from the planet Malastare, and was one of the most famous pod racers to ever participate in the sport. Sebulba was known for his dirty racing as a cheater, and had illegal flamethrowers installed on his pod to take out other racers, which he did with malicious joy on several occasions. Since he was a Dug, he was arboreal, meaning that he could use his limbs interchangeably, and while he preferred to walk on his hands and use his legs for fine motor control, when he operated his pod, the roles were reversed, and he flew with his arms on the main controls. Sebulba was cruel and arrogant, and this translated directly into his racing style. During the Boonta Eve race, he managed to eliminate several racers on the track. That is, until the final lap when he tangled with Anakin Skywalker. Despite his best efforts to eliminate the human boy by sabotaging his pod prior to the race and then bashing into him on the final lap, Anakin would come up a winner, boosting away from Sebulba as his engines careened away from his cockpit and exploded, sending the Dug sliding across the Tatooine flats, where he finally came to a rest and cursed the day he met Anakin Skywalker. This defeat burned the Dug greatly, though it did not stop him, as he immediately went to Qui-Gon Jinn and purchased Anakin's pod, modifying it and upgrading it to race in future events, where he continued to be a terrifying force to other racers while still being a skilled racer himself. After Sebulba retired, his son and grandson would eventually race pods as well, though they were both not nearly as good as Sebulba was. Teemto Pagalies was a male Vecnoid from the planet Moonus Mandal, and was a fairly jovial racer that enjoyed partying and hanging out in the local cantinas of whatever world he was racing on. Interestingly, Teemto was in exile from his homeworld due to the fact that he rejected an offer of matrimony from a beautiful Vecnoid princess. He became a wanderer, going from job to job in the Outer Rim, never really finding his place, until he found pod racing. Teemto was a notorious drunkard, often partying to celebrate his success. He was also somewhat of a blowhard, like many of the other pod racers, but kept a close eye on his rival racers to see how they operated. Teemto raced fairly well in the Boonta, until his pod was shot down in the Canyon Dune turn by sniping Tusken Raiders. Despite his cockpit spinning at incredible speeds after it hit the ground, Teemto managed to survive the crash, though it melted off his ears and gave him a few other injuries. However, he continued racing after this, and racked up several more injuries, eventually losing an eye and an arm over the course of several years. After the Empire took over and outlawed pod racing, Teemto worked in a swoop garage, and it was here that he met Leia Organa, who had been looking for information regarding Anakin Skywalker, and the boy that he had once been. Teemto eventually sent Leia a copy of the holo video of the same Boonta Eve Classic race that Anakin Skywalker won, which brought comfort to Leia as she learned more about the boy that had once been a kind and caring individual. Wan Sandage was a male devlik from the planet Ord Rodama, and was considered as somewhat of a playboy on his homeworld. Devliks had a very short lifespan as a species, and Sandage wanted to preserve his legacy in the record books by defeating Sebulba in a pod race, no matter what it took. He paid hitman Aldar Beedo to take out Sebulba, but the hitman failed, and while Beedo placed third and Sebulba was out of the race, it went poorly for Sandage, who crashed his pod racer in the second lap by veering off course and slamming into a sandcrawler. This did not stop him though, and after he rebuilt his pod, he raced again on Malastare. He teamed up with Aldar Beedo yet again, but again they failed to take out the cheating Dug and his pod racer, despite their best efforts. Unfortunately, Sandage would not live to see his record established, as he was only 9 years old when he died, though he did have a son who raced in his stead, Wan Sandage Jr. And while he too was a decent racer, he did not land in the record books either, like his father aimed to do while he was alive. These were all the racers that appeared in the Boonta Eve Classic, and while many of them had pretty varied histories and diverse backgrounds, they all had one thing in common: the love of the adrenaline-pumping, highly dangerous sport of pod racing, where the line between victory and defeat was so thin that even the most skilled racers could perish in a ball of flame before they even had time to react. Want to know more about great Star Wars topics just like this one? Head over to my channel and check out my other videos. Hit those like and subscribe buttons and the bell to be notified every time I publish something new. Be sure to select all notifications to be notified every time I post something new. Be sure to chat with me in the comments too, because I really want to talk to you. Be sure to check out my Hyperbites as well for more condensed versions of these episodes. Thank you so much for watching this one, and I will see you in the next one.